we have taken a look at Washington and his role in the acceptance of the Constitution by the various 13 states. And then we discussed his reluctance, but nevertheless his ascendancy, if you will, to the presidency. And the idea that he knew that everything he did would be viewed as a precedent, as an example to be set for generations to come, be it good or bad. So his first term was a term in which he tread lightly, he learned from his mistakes, and he chose a cabinet to surround him that was, as we put it, a cabinet of superstars. A second term, which again he had no intention of taking, was thrust upon him through the machinations, if you will, of a Thomas Jefferson and an Alexander Hamilton, two men who never agreed, but on this they did. The necessity of having Washington around for at least another 4 years. So pushing the right buttons, they were able to get Washington to agree to one more term as president. And it is this second term that we're going to take a look at. It's during the second term that numerous problems are going to crop up, which are going to test his mettle as a leader of a country that is now going to be faced with the rise of political parties, or factions as they were sometimes called back then. And it was those factions or parties that Washington had repeatedly warned against.
It was in the year 17 that George Washington began his second and last term as U.S. President. During his first term in office, Washington had focused on getting the new federal government up and running. But as the dawn of the 19th century drew nearer, political problems at home and war in Europe increasingly challenged the United States government. At the same time, an industrial revolution was occurring, and it was bringing about big changes in the way that goods were manufactured. This revolution set off a chain of events that would come to have an enormous impact on the U.S. economy. And it would also cause great differences to develop between the way people lived in the increasingly industrial northern states and the mostly agricultural southern states.
So Washington would begin the term with a problem, and that problem would take place in far-off France, and that, of course, is the French Revolution. It had begun at the very beginning of Washington's term, but did not present much of a problem. Now, keep in mind, remember that Washington brought home from France Thomas Jefferson to serve as his Secretary of State. And of course, it was Jefferson and Hamilton, one of Washington's closest advisors, that disagreed on everything and agreed on nothing except the importance of George Washington. The French Revolution would bring Washington to a fork in the road. And what I mean by that is he now has two different ways he can go. One favored by Hamilton, the other favored by Jefferson. This would be one of the first times he was going to be forced to choose between the two. And what came out of it was going to have a large and lasting impact on the United States. The Federalists, as they became known as, and these were the people that were in favor, of course, of Hamilton's view of the country, they were against the French Revolution. They saw the violence of that revolution increase tenfold during this time period. And it was violence that they had predicted for themselves after Shays' Rebellion that, of course, brought about the Constitution. They did not want to see this again. The Republicans, on the other hand, the Jeffersonian Republicans, led, of course, by Thomas Jefferson, were in favor of the revolution. They saw it as a fight for liberty. And, of course, they felt that we should be beholden to France because without them, we might not have achieved our independence. All of this eventually was going to lead to war between Great Britain and France, a war that would last a long, long time, a war that would bring us such luminaries, of course, as Napoleon and, of course, Wellington, the Iron Duke from Great Britain. Washington's idea, a mixture between the two of them, all right, was this. America's first official foreign policy was Washington's proclamation of neutrality. We were not going to get involved in France and Great Britain's war. We thought we would be able, and rather naively, by the way, to carry on trade with the both of them, favoring neither of them. Of course, what loomed in the background was a treaty that we had signed in 1778 with France, a treaty of mutual support. And now France is calling upon that treaty. Of course, Hamilton argued that treaty was with King Louis, who had since been beheaded and therefore was non-binding. All of this was going to lead which song and which flag would we follow? In France, as they believed in liberty, equality, and egalitarianism, they called everybody by the name of citizen. You were either a citizen or a citizeness. Therefore, everybody was equal. Well, of course, we know that really wasn't the case, but nonetheless, that's what they purported to believe. They are going to send the very young, in his early 20s, Genet to the United States to serve as ambassador. So Citizen Genet comes to the United States, and if you know anything about receiving ambassadors, what they're supposed to do, it's been since time immemorial, you go to the Capitol, you meet with the power that be. In this case, of course, it would have been George Washington. You present your credentials, officially identifying you as the representative of the country that you come from, and then you are having those credentials accepted, and you are installed as that country's ambassador. That is not what Genet did. Instead of landing in New York City, or by this time in Philadelphia, he will land in South Carolina and then slowly make his way up the coast. And at every stop, cheering throngs will come out to greet him. Our long lost French allies are now found. Citizen Genet became a cult hero, if you will. And as he made his way up the coast, he started societies in favor of the French Revolution, societies opposed to Great Britain. And he outfitted privateers, better known as pirates. He hired American ships and crews to sail from American ports to go out and attack British ships. And then when they brought back their prizes, he, Genet, would pay them for them. This is essentially a pirate. Well, this is something, of course, that flew in the face of the Proclamation of Neutrality. When he and Washington finally meet, he is going to insult Washington, and I'll show you that in just a second. Washington, on the other hand, orders that any of these privateers that come back into American ports are to be arrested and tried for violating U.S. policy. Well, some were arrested, some were tried, and Genet in turn bribed the juries. All of this well known to Washington. So Edmund Genet has stirred up a hornet's nest. Washington learns that Genet has commissioned privateers, that he has set up a French court in New York City to take the British prizes, that he's purchased ammunition from America, instead of us using it the other way around, shipped off to France, and he's hiring volunteers in an expedition against Spanish Florida. All of this, of course, was going to involve us extremely deeply in that war.
This is the end of monarchy! The end of tyranny! King Louis is dead! Long live the French and American Republic!
Now that war has been declared between your country and Great Britain, we must remain neutral. Ambassador Genet. The United States is a new and independent nation. It is in our best national interest to keep ourselves apart from affairs to which we have no attachment.
Surely the cause of France is the cause of America, of the world. A threat to France is a threat to America. And we have a treaty, Mr. President. A treaty made when you were at war with England.
I remind the ambassador that our treaty with France was made with King Louis. The king's murder renders that compact no longer binding.
Thousands of your people have called themselves our brother. Since I landed in America, I have found many willing to fight.
You will refrain, Ambassador Genet, from any further efforts to recruit our citizens to belligerent actions. I will not allow you to outfit privateers to join in your war against England.
It is not for you to tell me this.
Tread carefully, sir.
The people will command me as they command you.
Ambassador Genet.
You will hear from me again, sir. And then I will speak to you with a million voices, and you will obey.
The famous French diplomacy.
Mr. Jefferson. Ambassador Genet has taken leave of his senses.
Now, Washington then demands of Jefferson that Genet be removed and his credentials be taken back. He will not be accepted as the ambassador to the United States. Now, what you should know is behind the scenes, Jefferson bordered on treason because he was telling the French that Washington was old, had taken leave of his senses, if you will, and that it was really Hamilton that was running the government. And if they would do A, B, and C, they being the French, then Jefferson would be able to steer American foreign policy in a way that the French desired. So obviously, Jefferson's loyalty was not to Washington. Ironically, later on in another administration, Jefferson would go even a little bit further than that. And today, of course, that would be grounds for impeachment. Back then, it was not widely known that Jefferson was doing this. So, Washington will have Genet removed. Genet realizes that he has failed, and he's afraid to go back to France because he's afraid of receiving a new French haircut below the chin. So he stays. He's going to marry a hairdresser from Buffalo with 7 kids, and he goes into the business as a hairdresser himself, never to return to France. In the meantime, by the way, there would be a problem in New York City. If you remember, the governor of New York, Livingston, who had sworn Washington in that brief film clip that we saw, and was mad at Washington because he did not give Livingston a government post. Livingston makes New York City a haven for privateers and for the French Navy, who are sailing from there to attack British ships in the area of Canada. Well, it almost looks like they're going to take over New York City. Washington is beside himself. Besides the bribing of juries by Genet, I mean, this is out and out disloyalty and, again, treason. What saves the day will be the American mosquito. That's right, that damn bug is going to spread yellow fever among the French Navy, forcing them to leave the confines of New York Harbor and sail out to sea in order to avoid the disease. And that's what puts an end to the Citizen Genet affair, and of course, the French trying to drag us into the war. At this same time, Washington is negotiating with Britain, trying to lower the temperature that is calling for war. A war he felt at this point in time we were not ready to conduct. So he takes his best negotiator, the man who happens to be the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Jay. Jay, who had helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which of course had ended the American Revolution, will go over to Great Britain, and he tries to deal with what you see there on the screen. American ships were being stopped and seized on the high seas by the British Navy. Sailors were being taken off. Sailors that the British claimed were, of course, people who had fled the British Navy, and they were just taking them back. Well, they took, all told, perhaps some 50-some thousand U.S. sailors, most of them not deserters from the British Navy. You still have British forts in the West, some of which were inspiring and arming the Indians to attack our troops and our settlers. And then the infamous Orders of Council, in which they would stop any American ship that was sailing into any French port throughout the world. And that, of course, included the French West Indies. So there you have the British fleet, various parts of the United States, all of them being used to inspire the Indians, to arm the Indians, and give them supplies. He wants them removed. He wants the impressment of sailors to stop, and he wants the seizing of U.S. ships to stop and to be paid for in terms of the damages. Well, John Jay comes home with a treaty that is not to the liking of the American people. Somehow, some way, someone gets an advance copy of that treaty, and before Jay is even landed in the United States, that treaty is made public in various newspapers, Jeffersonian Republican newspapers. Was it Jefferson that leaked the treaty? After all, he is Secretary of State, but no one knows. Jay claimed that when he landed in Philadelphia, the shores of the entire eastern seaboard were lit with effigies of him being hung and burned. Jay was obviously extremely unpopular, as was Washington. It was so bad that Washington and Martha had to hide under the dining room table in their executive mansion in Philadelphia as bricks were thrown through it. That's right. The great George Washington had incurred the wrath of the people. What was this all about? Well, Jay's Treaty basically accomplished none of the goals. They did manage to get the forts removed, but impressment, which was the biggest issue, was not solved, and that would not be solved until after the War of 1812. He did not get the Orders of Council revoked. American ships were still constantly stopped, and they refused to pay for any damages. One of the things, of course, the South wanted, and this all goes all the way back to the Revolution, they wanted money to pay for all of the slaves that had escaped during the American Revolution and had fought on the side of the British. They felt that the British owed them that money. And of course, the British just scoffed at that. So Jay's Treaty did accomplish, however, the one thing that Washington was aiming at. And that was, of course, the removal of the chances for war. And in that respect, in Washington's view, that was successful. So he puts his weight behind Jay's Treaty, and it will pass in the United States Senate. In the meantime, the continued expansion of America westward was ongoing. And all of this land, all the way up to the Mississippi River, and don't think that Americans really stopped there at that natural boundary, had continued. But this ratcheted up tensions between the settlers and the Native Americans. A gentleman by the name of Little Turtle, chief of the Miami people, formed a confederacy, kind of a preview of coming attractions of several groups against the white settlers. And they were extremely successful. They will defeat a poorly led large army led by Arthur St. Clair, who was the governor of the Western Territory and now had free reign in the Western area. Washington will approach a gentleman by the name of General Anthony Wayne. His nickname was Mad Anthony Wayne, from, of course, New Jersey. Mad Anthony Wayne was asked to defeat the Indian Confederacy out west. Initially, he refused. Washington appealed again, and then he will, Wayne that is, lead an army into the west, and at the Battle of Fallen Timbers will decisively defeat the Indians, forcing them in 1795 to sign the Treaty of Greenville. The Greenville Treaty, well, gave us the entire Ohio Territory in perpetuity, which means forever, in exchange for a yearly payment of $10,000 from the government. Did we live up to that? No. Did we pay him $10,000 every year? Absolutely not. Did we get the land? Oh, yes. And there wasn't much the Indians could do about it after that decisive defeat led by one of the heroes of the American Revolution from New Jersey, General Mad Anthony Wayne. So now the way is open for even more settlers to the way west. And now more good news. Thomas Pinckney will negotiate a treaty with Spain. Jefferson has left as Secretary of State, replaced by Pinckney. And we had run into periodically the closing of the Mississippi River, particularly the port of New Orleans, by the Spanish. Well, Pinckney will negotiate a treaty in which we will get what's called the right of deposit, meaning that our farmers could go down the Mississippi River, and that's all you could do is go down it. Again, remember, steam had not been invented, so we could not go up. Down the Mississippi River, deposit our goods in the port of New Orleans, there to be shipped to the East Coast and wherever. This, of course, helped solve the way for the settlers who were going west because now this was easier than bringing the goods back across country and, of course, across the mountains, namely the Allegheny. So Washington now becomes somewhat of a hero to those in the West with the advent of Pinckney's Treaty. But by this time, Washington is now looking forward to the end of his term. He has Madison write what becomes known as his farewell address early in his first term. But now, with the end of the second, he has a number of people, including Hamilton, work upon it. But the ideas essentially are Washington's. And in that speech, now when I say speech, it's not like he got up at a lectern or a podium and addressed an assembled audience. This was his speech, which was printed in various newspapers throughout the United States, Federalist newspapers, no less. Of course, the Republican papers excoriated Washington during his entire 8 years, calling him names that nobody would ever call him to his face. Washington's farewell address warns the country against the evils of faction of political parties. He begs them not to get involved with that. He also talks about non-entangling alliances, that we should maintain our policy of non-involvement, of isolationism. Permanently? No, that was not his intent, but that's the way it's going to be interpreted. He just feels that we are not ready to participate in world affairs, particularly militarily, at this point in time. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake. He predicted the interference of foreign countries in our own elections. Think about, of course, what recently happened.
Washington would be the first president made the presidency seem much more palatable.
Washington knew that some kind of cabinet structure would be necessary. And he very consciously created such a group with powerful figures. And then he had to work out what the president's procedures would be with respect to the other branches of government.
Relations with the Senate are undoubtedly the most challenging for the country's first president.
For example, what did it mean for the Senate to advise and consent? Washington was very keen on this. Were they going to tell him what to do? Or was he going to go and beg consent? How would this work? He made a mistake at one point by appearing before the Senate, appealing for their support at one point. He learned his lesson fast and never went back. But he did it through messages. And it was, I think, his dignity and his commitment to making this system work, which had a lot to do with the success of the government. You can say the design of the Constitution was extremely effective, that it had everything you needed, but it was just a piece of paper.
So, as he left the presidency, he had given dignity to the office. He had made it an office to be reckoned with and respected. He set numerous and sundry precedents that would be followed by all, such as the establishment of a cabinet, a national bank, which would be a point of controversy for quite some time. He made sure that a Judiciary Act is passed, establishing the setup of America's federal court system. He lives up to the promise of a Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution and signs them into law. The issuance of the Neutrality Proclamation, keeping us out, as best he could, of European wars. The two-term tradition, which will be followed up until the 1940s, when FDR, of course, will be elected 4 times. And, of course, crushing the Whiskey Rebellion and establishing the power of the federal government. All of this by George Washington. When he runs for a second term in 1792, he, of course, is unanimously reelected. The vote would be 132 to nothing. And remember, that was because those around him, whether they agreed with him or not, realized this was not the time for the nation to try to prove that it could do without him. They could not. He will suffer much. He was a man that, of course, was obsessed with his own reputation. And of course, as the longer he stayed around, the more criticism he received. It stung him deeply. The day that he left office, this is what he said: "This day ought to be a jubilee." He leaves office at the age of 64. Think about it. Biden gets elected at the age of 78. Washington's leaving at the age of 64. December 14th, 1799, he dies in the evening at the age of 67. He had gone out earlier that day to, as he always did, ride around his estate to supervise various projects that were taking place all over. Now, this particular day happened to be a rather rainy, sleety, snowy day. It was very cold outside. Comes back in, chilled to the bone, goes upstairs. He will not come back down. He develops a serious cold. Doctors are brought in. The treatment during that time period was to bleed somebody. They would slice your wrists, put your open wrist over a hot basin of water to draw out the bad blood, thinking that would make you better. Of course, it didn't. So then they did it in his other wrist, further weakening him. This happens today. He's taken a few pills, going to bed, and he'd be fine. That was not going to be the case back then. Many people think that it was the cure that killed him. Washington will die that evening. Which necessitates, of course, his leaving the office, an election that will be one of the most important elections in all of American history. And we'll talk about this in our concluding lecture. This will finish chapter 6. The election of 1796 will start chapter 7.